Get this man off my yacht before he embarrasses himself any further. He looks like he belongs in the kitchen washing dishes, not standing next to millionaires," the hostess shouted, her voice sharp as glass. And that is the shocking beginning of our story tonight. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Comment your city, hit subscribe, and like to share this powerful story. Now let us step into the first chapter of a night that began with humiliation and ended with one of the most unforgettable reversals in modern memory. A story that unfolded on the deck of a $100 million yacht floating in the harbor of Miami, where the wealthy and powerful had gathered in glittering gowns and tuxedos, never suspecting that they were about to witness history. Malcolm Carter had walked onto the Liberty Star quietly, without fanfare, wearing a simple navy suit, a crisp white shirt, and polished shoes that carried no designer logo. He did not arrive with an entourage. No bodyguards pushed through the crowd, and to the eyes of many he looked like an ordinary guest, perhaps even someone who had wandered into the wrong place. Heather Collins, the head hostess employed by Oceanic Prestige Yacht Services, saw him as an easy target, a chance to demonstrate authority, and with a smirk, she blocked his path, her voice raised not in private correction, but in public spectacle, loud enough to draw the attention of 200 guests. The first insult fell like a hammer, calling him boy, insisting the kitchen staff would be happy to have him, words laced with the venom of assumption. Then, as if humiliation were not enough, she reached for the glass of red wine in his hand and poured it over his jacket, the liquid staining the cloth in a slow, cruel spread that drew gasps and laughter from nearby onlookers. Phones rose into the air, lenses catching every drop of the spectacle, in this crowd of supposed sophistication. Many chose not to intervene but to document, to post, to whisper to one another that this man clearly did not belong. Heather smiled wider as the circle of spectators grew, basking in the role of protector of exclusivity. And she went further, turning to the audience as if on a stage, declaring that every year imposters tried to sneak in, that some people just did not understand the meaning of class, that security would take care of him soon enough. Malcolm Carter did not shout. He did not fight back. He simply removed a handkerchief from his pocket and dabbed at his sleeve, moving with the patience of a man who had endured this theater too many times before. And in that calmness lay a kind of power the hostess could not recognize. Sophia Ramirez, a young blogger covering society events, was already broadcasting live on her phone. Her voice hushed but urgent as she told her audience that something extraordinary was happening, that an apparent guest had just been drenched with wine and mocked in front of hundreds, her live stream viewership climbing rapidly with each second. Comments began to fill the screen, some outraged, others skeptical, but all captivated by the unfolding scene. Still, Heather pressed forward, instructing guests to check their purses, to hold tight to their jewelry, to assume the worst of the man standing silently before them. 2 security guards appeared at her side, tall men in dark jackets, their earpieces buzzing, and Heather ordered them to escort Malcolm to the back entrance, declaring he was not a guest, declaring he had no invitation, declaring that he was nothing but a fraud. And here is where the cruelty sharpened. She stooped, picked up a napkin from a nearby table, and tossed it at his feet, telling him to wipe the wine from the deck before leaving, telling him to earn his place through service instead of audacity. The crowd murmured. Some chuckled uncomfortably. Others shifted with unease, but no one stepped between them. Malcolm raised his head, his eyes steady, his jaw tight, and at last he spoke, not loudly, not angrily, but with words that carried across the silent air. "You have made a mistake, and before this evening is done, you will understand the cost of that mistake." His tone was measured, his posture unbroken, and it sent a ripple through those listening. Though Heather laughed in response, dismissing his warning as the empty bravado of a man caught where he did not belong. The minutes ticked on. A digital countdown screen above the deck showed that only a few remained before the official presentation of the night would begin. Yet the spotlight of attention had shifted entirely to this confrontation. Guests whispered about whether police should be called, whether valuables had gone missing, whether they were witnessing the exposure of a con artist, never realizing that the truth would soon humiliate the very woman who believed she was in control. Sophia's live stream passed tens of thousands of viewers, the chat scrolling with accusations of racism, with pleas for someone to step in, with predictions that a revelation was coming. Though none could imagine its scale, Malcolm Carter adjusted his sleeve once more, the faint glimmer of a watch visible, a timepiece that in itself was worth more than some of the cars parked outside. But the crowd did not recognize it, or chose not to. They saw only what they expected to see. And in those expectations lay the entire tragedy of that moment. Heather barked once more, ordering security to grab his arms, to move him forcibly, declaring to all within earshot that she would not tolerate his presence another second. The guards hesitated, unsure. For there was something about Malcolm's composure that did not align with the profile of an intruder. But Heather pushed them forward with the arrogance of someone certain that her judgment could not be questioned. And so the first act of this night ended in tension, thick as smoke. A man of immense stature in the business world, a man who had built an empire from nothing, stood accused and humiliated on his own yacht, drenched in wine, insulted as a fraud, while a woman intoxicated by her temporary power relished in his disgrace. The crowd was complicit, the phones were rolling, and the stage was set for a revelation that would not only shatter Heather's career, but ripple through an entire industry. This was the beginning, the spark of humiliation that would ignite a fire of accountability. And the quiet resolve in Malcolm Carter's eyes promised that the story was far from over. For as the countdown clock continued its march toward the presentation, the man they believed to be an imposter was preparing to show them who truly held the keys to Liberty Star, and to the future of everyone watching. The crowd thickened around the center of the deck, their glittering gowns and tailored tuxedos forming a ring of judgment, and in that circle stood Malcolm Carter, still calm, his jacket stained deep crimson by the wine Heather Collins had so proudly spilled. The silence between them broken only by the buzz of phones as more and more guests recorded the unfolding spectacle. And in that instant, Sofia Ramirez's live stream surged past 30,000 viewers. Her whispered narration carried across the country, fueling outrage and fascination as strangers typed in disbelief that such open humiliation could happen in a room full of America's elite. Yet here it was, a modern coliseum where cruelty became entertainment. Heather, emboldened by the attention, raised her chin and declared once more that this man was an intruder, her voice carrying with the shrill triumph of someone convinced she was untouchable, telling everyone to hold on to their purses, to check their watches, to assume that the stranger before them was already planning to steal, and each word was another knife twisted into Malcolm's dignity, another reminder of the centuries-old prejudice that reduced men like him to suspects rather than guests. 2 security guards flanked him, their hands hovering near his arms, not quite ready to grab him but close enough that the threat was plain. And Heather snapped at them to stop hesitating, to remove him before he embarrassed the entire event. Her tone dripped with disdain as she accused him of stalling, of plotting, of being a con man who had watched a YouTube video on how to sneak into high society parties. And the crowd chuckled nervously, eager to align with her certainty rather than confront the discomfort of what they were seeing. Sophia. Her phone lifted high, whispered to her audience that she had never witnessed such arrogance, that the hostess was not only humiliating a man without evidence, but was dragging everyone else into complicity, and comments flew in demanding someone intervene. But none of the guests moved forward, because in circles of wealth, silence often feels safer than courage. Heather reached again, this time grabbing at Malcolm's wallet as he produced it slowly from his jacket, and with a flick of her wrist, she slapped the leather case from his hand, sending it skittering across the deck before tumbling into the dark waters below, and the crowd gasped at the audacity, some laughing as if it were a trick, others wincing as the cruelty sharpened, and Heather smiled wide, crowing that a fake ID would not save him, that cheap cards bought online could not prove his worth, that she had unmasked yet another fraud. Malcolm bent slightly, straightening again without speaking, his eyes fixed not on her, but on the countdown screen overhead, the digits marching steadily toward the start of the gala's grand announcement. And though his silence was heavy, the calm lines of his face betrayed not defeat, but the patience of a man waiting for the precise moment to strike. Charles Whitman, the yacht's manager, was rushing up from below deck, summoned by Heather's frantic call, and when he appeared with his tablet clutched in hand, the atmosphere thickened with expectation. Heather greeted him with relief, her voice loud enough to echo across the deck, insisting this intruder be removed, insisting he was harassing guests, insisting security take him away at once. And the guards stepped closer, their hesitation fading under the authority of their superior's arrival. Charles raised a hand, signaling them to pause, his instincts whispering that something was wrong, that the man standing so serenely in the center did not behave like an imposter. And with a tone carefully balanced between diplomacy and firmness, he asked Malcolm for identification, for an invitation, for anything that could explain his presence. But before Malcolm could respond, Heather pounced again, declaring that she had already seen his fake cards, already witnessed his pathetic attempt to trick them, demanding that Charles trust her judgment, that he not fall for what she claimed was a scam as old as hospitality itself. Guests muttered agreement, some emboldened to shout questions, one asking how Malcolm had afforded to get through the Marina Gate, another scoffing that parking alone cost more than most people earned in a week, and their laughter rose. Nervous yet eager to belong to the crowd's mood, the prejudice had shifted from a single voice to a chorus, and Malcolm stood at its center, a man reduced to ridicule in front of hundreds. Sophia's live stream surged past 40,000 viewers, her whisper urgent now as she told her unseen audience that this was escalating dangerously, that the line between humiliation and violence was thinning, that they might witness a man being dragged away without cause. And still the comments poured in, demanding justice, demanding truth. Heather, eyes glittering with the rush of power, took the moment to escalate further, pulling out a napkin and dropping it at Malcolm's feet, telling him to clean the deck before leaving, telling him to do something useful for once. And the cruelty of the gesture was not lost on those watching. Though no one dared step forward, the countdown overhead showed less than 5 minutes to the grand presentation, the moment when the entire evening's purpose would be revealed. But now all eyes were on this confrontation, and the irony was thick. The very man they were mocking held in his hand the power to change everything. Yet they could not see past their assumptions. Malcolm looked around the circle of faces, saw the judgment etched in their eyes, and spoke at last, his voice calm but steady, his words cutting through the noise like a blade. "You believe I don't belong because of what you see, but soon enough, you will understand exactly who I am, and why this moment will be remembered long after tonight." The crowd shifted uneasily. Charles frowned, and Heather laughed, mocking the gravitas of his tone, telling everyone to stop indulging his theatrics. But somewhere in the room, in the silence after his words, a seed of doubt began to grow, faint but undeniable. And as the guards reached once more for his arms, the stage was set for the first reversal of the night, a reversal that would silence laughter, shatter arrogance, and reveal the truth that no one expected. The countdown screen glowed above the deck, its red numbers ticking toward 0, and the atmosphere on the Liberty Star had grown unbearable, a mix of nervous laughter, whispered doubts, and the heavy expectation that the man in the center would soon be dragged away in disgrace. Yet Malcolm Carter remained unshaken, his jacket still damp with wine, his hands steady as stone, his eyes fixed not on the guards closing in, but on the clock itself. And when only 3 minutes remained, he finally moved, slowly pulling his phone from his pocket. A simple gesture that drew fresh suspicion from Heather Collins, who barked that he was calling accomplices, that he was stalling for time, that he thought backup could save him. And the crowd murmured nervously. But Malcolm ignored her voice, his thumb hovering over one contact, labeled only bridge, before pressing down with deliberate finality. And in that instant, the yacht itself seemed to breathe, every screen across the deck flickering to black, the music cutting mid-note, the ambient lights dimming until only the navigation beams glowed across the harbor, plunging the glamorous gathering into an eerie hush. Gasps rippled through the guests as they looked around, confused, unsettled, some clutching their champagne glasses tightly, others staring at their phones as though the sudden darkness might have swallowed their sense of safety. Heather sputtered, waving her arms, shouting that the circuits were old, that power failures were common, that nothing unusual had happened. But her words carried less conviction now, for even Charles Whitman, the seasoned yacht manager, had gone pale, his fingers trembling against his tablet as he realized this was no ordinary glitch. Malcolm lowered his phone calmly, slipped it back into his pocket, and for the first time all evening he smiled. Not the smile of a man amused, but the thin, cold smile of someone who had chosen his moment. And his voice rose into the silence, measured and resonant, each word carrying the authority of truth. "Mr. Whitman," he said, his tone deliberate, "I own this vessel." The words struck like a thunderclap, silencing the murmurs, freezing the laughter, replacing the sneers with stunned disbelief. For a heartbeat, no one spoke, until Heather burst into hysterical laughter, declaring he was delusional, declaring he was insane, mocking him as the Queen of England's cousin, insisting that Charles not listen to him. Yet Charles could not look away, his trembling fingers scrolling through the yacht's registration database, his breath quickening as the truth appeared on his screen. Owner: Malcolm Carter. Registered under Carter Global Holdings. Purchased 18 months earlier at the Fort Lauderdale International Boat Show. Value $145 million. The tablet slipped from his nerveless hands and clattered onto the marble deck, the sound echoing louder than any voice. And a murmur of shock swept through the guests, phones rising higher, lenses zooming closer, disbelief spreading across every face as they realized the man they had dismissed was in fact the host of the evening. Sofia Ramirez, her live stream climbing past 60,000 viewers, whispered into her phone that they were witnessing the most extraordinary revelation she had ever seen, that the man they mocked was the owner of the yacht and the very benefactor of the gala, and her audience erupted with outrage and awe. Malcolm did not gloat, did not raise his voice. He simply reached again into his jacket and drew out a small black fob, pressing it once to shift the navigation lights from white to blue, then back to white. A quiet demonstration of control that needed no further explanation. The Liberty Star responded only to him, and the message was undeniable. Heather's laughter faltered, her eyes darting from the lights to the banner above the deck that she had ignored all night. The banner reading Carter Global Foundation, Annual Gala for Future Horizons. Words that now burned into her mind like a cruel joke. For she had humiliated the man whose name had been hanging before her all along. Guests began to murmur, some whispering that they had seen his face on magazine covers, others recalling keynote speeches, one even pulling up a photo on Google that matched the man before them perfectly. And the weight of recognition spread like fire across the deck. Malcolm looked directly at Heather, his expression still calm but edged with profound disappointment. And he spoke again, his words softer but more devastating than any shout. "You assumed I was an imposter? You assumed I was a thief? You assumed I was dangerous? And you made those assumptions in front of witnesses, in front of cameras, based on nothing but prejudice? And now we will reckon with that choice?" Heather stumbled backward, her voice faltering, insisting she was following security protocols, insisting she was protecting the event. But even Charles whispered, barely audible, that their company had a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. That termination was immediate in cases like this. His words twisting the knife of reality into her already crumbling facade. Malcolm gestured toward the countdown, which now showed less than a minute, and said with quiet gravity, "Tonight was meant to announce a $100 million donation to historically black colleges and universities, the largest single contribution of its kind. But instead of beginning that presentation, we are here addressing your actions, Miss Collins, and the consequences they have unleashed." The crowd inhaled sharply, realizing the magnitude of what had nearly been lost, realizing the depth of their complicity, realizing that in their silence they had stood by as the host of their gala was degraded. Heather's knees buckled, her hands shaking as she grasped a railing for support, tears beginning to streak her cheeks. But Malcolm did not soften, for his duty was not only to himself, but to the truth, to the lesson that prejudice carries a cost. Around them the guests shifted, shame washing over many, though a few still clung to disbelief, muttering that it was impossible. But the evidence was undeniable. From the registration on Charles's tablet, to the glowing banner above their heads, to the very heartbeat of the ship responding to Malcolm's hand. And so, as the countdown reached 0 and the screens remained dark, the gala's scheduled presentation dissolved into silence, replaced instead by the most unforgettable revelation of the season, a moment when arrogance collapsed, when truth thundered across the deck, and when a man's quiet dignity shattered the illusions of an entire crowd. Malcolm Carter stood tall in the center, no longer an accused intruder but the undisputed owner of Liberty Star. And though Heather wept, though Charles trembled, though the crowd shifted in shame, Malcolm's eyes held steady on the horizon of what was yet to come. For this reckoning was only beginning, and the transformation it would ignite would reach far beyond the deck of one yacht on one autumn night in Miami. The silence that followed Malcolm Carter's revelation hung heavier than the humid Miami air. 200 guests frozen in place, their jeweled hands gripping champagne flutes that no longer tasted sweet, their designer shoes rooted to the marble deck as though the world itself had paused. And into that silence Malcolm spoke, his voice low but unshakable, words dropping like stones into still water. "Miss Collins, you accused me of being an intruder. You poured wine on me. You called me boy. You told me to clean the deck. You summoned security to drag me away. You tried to strip me of dignity in front of witnesses. And now, with every eye upon us, I will ask you one question. On what evidence did you build your certainty?" Heather Collins trembled, her voice thin, insisting that she was protecting the event, that she was following security protocol. But her excuses crumbled against the reality that her judgment had been based on nothing more than clothing, complexion, and assumption. And the crowd felt it, the weight of her prejudice pressing on their own silence, their own complicity. Charles Whitman, the yacht manager, still pale from what he had discovered on his tablet, whispered that company policy demanded zero tolerance for discrimination, his words so soft they might have been a prayer. Yet the implication thundered, because zero tolerance meant her career had ended before she could even form her next excuse. Sophia Ramirez, her live stream still rolling, her audience past 70,000 now, whispered into her phone that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Not just the humiliation of a hostess, but a reckoning for an entire company. And her viewers typed furiously, their outrage swelling into a wave of accountability that could not be contained. Malcolm turned, not only to Heather but to the gathered crowd, his gaze sweeping across tuxedos and diamonds, his tone rising with controlled force. You all saw, you all heard, you laughed, you recorded, you allowed this to continue, and not one of you asked if perhaps there had been a mistake. Not one of you stepped forward to question whether justice was being done. And that silence is what sustains prejudice. That silence is the accomplice of every insult. Guests shifted uncomfortably, a few lowering their phones, some looking down at the deck as if the marble could hide them, others staring at Heather with eyes that now brimmed with contempt instead of agreement. Realizing they had followed her arrogance like sheep following a shepherd, Malcolm gestured to the banner above. Carter Global Foundation Annual Gala. Words shining in silver letters. A banner ignored until this moment, and his voice grew stronger. The name has been here all along, yet no one cared to look, because you trusted the easy story. The story that said a man who looks like me could not belong here. And tonight that easy story is exposed as a lie. Heather shook her head desperately, insisting again that she was only doing her job. But Malcolm pressed forward, his words precise and relentless. Your job is hospitality. Your job is dignity. Your job is to welcome guests, not to humiliate them. And you failed that job not in private but in public. And the record of that failure will remain long after this night ends. Charles cleared his throat, attempting to salvage some authority, and muttered that disciplinary measures would be handled internally. But Malcolm's eyes cut through him like a blade, and he declared firmly, "No, Mr. Whitman, this conversation will not be hidden. This conversation happens here, before these witnesses, before these cameras. Transparency is the only safeguard against repetition." His words landed like a gavel strike. And in that moment, the deck itself became a courtroom. The guests, the jury, the phones, the record keepers, and Heather, the defendant, trembling under the weight of her own arrogance. Malcolm reached into his jacket and pulled out a slim folder that had somehow remained dry despite the earlier wine, unfolding documents with the steadiness of a man who had planned this moment. And he began to read. Prestige Yacht Services, Employee Contract. Section 4.2, Clause C, violation of non-discrimination policy results in immediate termination and forfeiture of benefits. Gasps swept through the crowd, the words like a sentence being passed, and Heather's knees buckled as she clung to the railing, mascara streaking down her cheeks, whispers rippling among the guests that they were witnessing the end of her career in real time. Malcolm did not relent, his voice unwavering. Miss Collins, you have violated this clause repeatedly in the past 10 minutes, publicly, on record, and the consequence is unavoidable. Termination for cause, effective immediately. Heather sobbed, trying to form words of apology. But Malcolm continued, layering truth upon truth. You physically assaulted me by pouring wine upon my head. You verbally degraded me by calling me boy. You insinuated theft without proof. You attempted to have me arrested. Every act you committed tonight carries legal precedent, and I can cite them for you. Johnson versus Ritz-Carlton, 2024, $4.7 million in damages awarded for racial humiliation in hospitality. Patterson versus Marina Bay Club, 2023, $3.2 million for discriminatory profiling, and your actions mirror theirs, down to the language you used. The guests murmured in awe and fear, some whispering to one another about lawsuits, others realizing the financial devastation that one woman's arrogance had unleashed upon her employer. Heather tried to stammer that she was sorry, that she had not meant it, but Malcolm's voice cut through her pleas, steady and final. Sorry does not erase humiliation. Sorry does not restore dignity. Sorry does not rebuild trust. Only change does. And tonight that change begins with you. The guards who had once stood ready to remove him now looked at the deck, ashamed to have nearly played a role in this injustice, and Malcolm gestured to them gently, telling them they could return to their posts, that this situation was now under his personal authority, and they obeyed with visible relief. The crowd, still silent, began to understand that they were witnessing not just a personal defense, but a structural dismantling, a lesson in accountability that extended beyond one employee, beyond one company, into the very fabric of their industry. And Malcolm allowed that realization to settle before he spoke again, his tone softening only slightly. This is not about revenge. This is not about one woman. This is about a system that allows arrogance and prejudice to masquerade as professionalism. And tonight we will not only hold an individual accountable, but demand systemic reform. The words fell heavy, resonant, undeniable. And the guests knew that the man they had dismissed was now conducting a trial not only of Heather Collins, but of every silent witness who had stood by. And as Heather wept, as Charles trembled, as Sophia's live stream soared past 80,000, Malcolm Carter stood in the center of the deck transformed, no longer a victim of humiliation, but the judge, the jury, and the architect of justice. The courtroom atmosphere on the deck of the Liberty Star deepened as Malcolm Carter paused, allowing silence to settle before he drew out the next blade of truth. And when he spoke, his words cut with the precision of a surgeon. Mr. Whitman, the contract between Carter Global Holdings and Oceanic Prestige Yacht Services is valued at $220 million annually. That figure represents maintenance, crew operations, gala management, and luxury client services across 6 of my vessels, and it sustains 2,000 jobs within your organization. His tone was steady, his delivery unhurried, but each number fell like a hammer, sending ripples of dread through Charles Whitman's already trembling frame, and the guests who moments earlier had mocked him now whispered in stunned recognition, realizing that what they had witnessed was not merely an insult, but a financial earthquake about to shake an entire corporation. Heather Collins clung to the railing, her sobs rising as the weight of her mistake pressed heavier. Not only had she destroyed her own career, but she had placed thousands of families at risk by igniting a scandal that could strip their company of its most valuable contract. Malcolm's gaze did not waver. His voice remained calm, but his words carried the weight of decades of struggle. All of this, he continued, gesturing around the deck, this entire empire of service, this illusion of exclusivity, rests on relationships, on trust, on respect. And tonight that foundation was shattered not by an accident, not by misunderstanding, but by arrogance and prejudice. Sophia Ramirez whispered into her live stream that the billionaire was dismantling an empire in real time, her audience surging toward 90,000, comments flooding with outrage and awe, people declaring that they were watching history, that they were witnessing the precise moment when silence gave way to justice. Charles stammered, trying to speak, but Malcolm raised his hand, silencing him with a glance, and then laid down his demands one by one, his words measured but firm. First, every guest-facing employee of Oceanic Prestige will undergo unconscious bias training, not once a year, not hidden in an online module, but quarterly, in person, with external facilitators, and the cost will not be passed to clients. It will be borne by your company as the price of rebuilding trust. Second, an anonymous reporting system will be built, accessible by every employee on a mobile app, with oversight not by your HR department, but by the American Civil Liberties Union, and real-time alerts will go directly to your board of directors. Third, your management structure will change. Within 18 months, 45% of leadership positions will be filled by qualified candidates from underrepresented groups, and executive bonuses will be tied directly to meeting those targets. Fourth, a public acknowledgement will be issued within 48 hours. Not a quiet resignation, not a cover story, but the truth. That discrimination occurred here tonight. That a zero-tolerance policy demands transparency, and that the company will use this shame as a case study to educate its workforce. The guests murmured, some in shock at the scale of his demands, others nodding quietly, realizing that reform had been long overdue. And Malcolm was not finished. His voice grew stronger, his words sharper. Fifth, Oceanic Prestige will contribute $20 million to establish scholarships for students pursuing careers in hospitality. Scholarships reserved for those who have been historically excluded from the very industry that profits from their labor. And this fund will be managed independently, not by your accountants, not by your executives, but by the United Negro College Fund, to ensure it reaches those it is meant to serve. Sixth, your company will partner with Carter Global to develop industry-wide standards for inclusive service, hosting annual conferences, producing certification programs, setting benchmarks that no competitor can ignore, and your organization will serve as the pilot, the proving ground, the example. Charles's face had gone ashen, sweat dripping at his temples as he typed frantically on his tablet, trying to capture each point, while Heather's sobs grew louder. For every word Malcolm spoke deepened the crater she had created, turning a personal humiliation into a corporate reckoning of monumental scale. The guests leaned closer, mesmerized, their jewels forgotten, their champagne warming in untouched glasses, because they knew they were not simply witnessing a man's defense. They were seeing the blueprint of an industry transformed, and Malcolm's steady voice carried with it the conviction of a man who had endured enough to understand the true cost of silence. "If you refuse," he said at last, his tone turning colder than steel, "if you choose to minimize, to hide, to deny, Carter Global Holdings will terminate every contract immediately. $220 million gone in a single motion. Our equity stake in your parent company will be divested through a hostile tender, and I will call every CEO in my circle of influence, 17 men and women who currently contract with you, and when they learn of tonight, they will not wait to reconsider. They will cut ties to protect their reputations. And you know as well as I do what that means. It means liquidation. It means layoffs. It means 1,000 families losing livelihoods because arrogance was allowed to masquerade as protocol." His words struck with devastating force, the guests audibly gasping, Charles nearly collapsing into a chair, Heather clutching her chest as though the air had turned to lead, and Sophia whispered into her phone, her voice breaking with awe. "He has taken control of the room, of the company, of the entire industry, and no one can stop him." Malcolm let the silence linger, let the weight of his ultimatum settle into every heart. And then he leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked on Charles, his voice dropping to a calm whisper that carried more power than any shout. "Do we have an agreement?" Charles nodded desperately, his voice cracking as he replied. "Yes, sir. All terms accepted. Implementation begins immediately." And the crowd exhaled as though they had been holding their breath for hours, realizing that they had just witnessed the signing of a new covenant, one forged not in ink, but in dignity, not in contracts, but in consequence. Heather collapsed fully then, sliding down the railing, her tears staining the marble as the enormity of what she had unleashed consumed her. And the guests turned away, some in pity, some in disgust, but none in defense, for the truth had been laid bare, and the cost of prejudice had been made undeniable. Malcolm stood tall, his jacket still stained, his posture unshaken, and in that moment he was no longer the man humiliated at the start of the night, but the architect of transformation, the voice of accountability, the embodiment of quiet power under fire. The night on the Liberty Star ended not with the triumphant gala that had been planned, but with the stunned dispersal of 200 guests who left in hushed clusters, their glittering shoes clicking across the marble deck, their voices subdued by the weight of what they had witnessed. And by dawn, the next morning, the entire city of Miami was buzzing with the story. Newspapers splashed headlines about a billionaire humiliated on his own yacht. Television anchors replayed shaky phone footage of Heather Collins pouring wine onto Malcolm Carter's jacket. And Sofia Ramirez's live stream had been viewed more than 2 million times before the sun had even risen. Her narration replayed on every major network, her voice trembling as she called the moment the clearest example of systemic arrogance she had ever documented. At the headquarters of Oceanic Prestige Yacht Services, panic set in by Saturday morning. The board convened in an emergency session, their conference room crowded with exhausted executives clutching coffee cups, their eyes bloodshot from a night of frantic phone calls. And at the head of the table, Charles Whitman sat pale and sweating, his tablet littered with emails from angry investors, corporate clients demanding answers, and journalists demanding statements, all asking the same question: how could such a public humiliation happen on their watch? Legal advisors scrambled to assess liability, one citing precedent after precedent, whispering that damages could easily climb into the tens of millions. While public relations consultants drafted apology after apology, none strong enough to erase the stain of the video already spreading across the world. Heather Collins had been terminated before sunrise, her access cards deactivated, her company phone confiscated, her belongings delivered to her apartment in cardboard boxes. But the gesture did nothing to stop the bleeding, for every article named her employer. Every broadcast paired her arrogance with the logo of Oceanic Prestige. And by mid-morning, the company's stock price had already fallen 8%. With analysts predicting worse to come, Malcolm Carter, meanwhile, remained silent, refusing interviews, declining comment, telling his team that transformation spoke louder than sound bites. And his silence only deepened the storm. For speculation grew with each hour. What demands had he made? What would the company sacrifice to appease him? And could they survive the loss of his $220 million contracts if he chose to walk away? Heather herself spiraled into collapse, her face plastered across news broadcasts, her name trending online in a storm of condemnation, her past actions dragged into the open as former colleagues recounted stories of arrogance, of dismissive treatment of minority staff. And by Sunday evening, she had been served with notice of a civil suit filed by Carter's legal team, not for personal enrichment, but for symbolic accountability. A suit demanding nearly $3 million in damages for public humiliation and assault, a figure carefully chosen to align with past discrimination settlements, ensuring that her actions would be forever tied to a precedent in law. Neighbors described seeing her pacing outside her apartment, phone pressed to her ear, shouting at family, at friends, insisting she had only been doing her job, that she had been set up. But sympathy was scarce, for the evidence was too clear, the cruelty too blatant, and even those who once admired her ambition now turned away. At Oceanic Prestige, employees whispered nervously in hallways, wondering if their jobs would survive the storm. And by Monday morning, entire departments were called into mandatory briefings where Charles Whitman, his face drawn and tired, explained that sweeping reforms were coming, reforms demanded by Carter himself, reforms that would change everything from hiring practices to executive pay structures. And while some resisted, fearing disruption, most felt a strange relief. For at last, the unspoken culture of quiet bias had been confronted. Shareholders panicked as the company's stock slid 18% by Monday's close, wiping nearly $1 billion from market value. And yet analysts on business networks began to shift their tone, noting that Carter's reforms, if implemented with speed and sincerity, could attract ESG investors, investors eager to reward companies that embraced inclusion, and the possibility of redemption flickered faintly at the edges of disaster. Malcolm returned to his office in Atlanta that Monday, meeting with his legal and executive team, his daughter stopping by after school to hug him and whisper that she had seen him on the news and that she was proud. And for the first time since the humiliation began, His face softened, the steel in his eyes warming for a moment, though he quickly returned to business, laying out timelines, demanding reports, reminding his team that this was bigger than one company, that this was about creating standards that would ripple across an entire industry. That same afternoon, the Wall Street Journal announced an upcoming front-page article titled, "When Bias Costs Billions," an article that would detail the entire saga, citing Carter's leverage as both a warning and a blueprint. And executives across the luxury hospitality sector braced for scrutiny, their own practices under sudden spotlight. Heather retreated from public view, refusing interviews, her attorney issuing a short statement claiming she had been unfairly vilified. But her words fell flat, drowned out by the tidal wave of outrage. And within 48 hours, she had become a pariah. Her name synonymous with arrogance, her future employment prospects erased in an industry where reputation is currency. Oceanic Prestige, facing collapse, sent representatives to Atlanta to meet with Carter Global Holdings, their delegation led by Charles Whitman himself, and for hours they sat across from Carter and his attorneys, reviewing point by point the reforms he had demanded, signing contracts that would bind them to timelines and oversight. And though Charles winced at the cost, he knew that refusal meant ruin, that compliance was their only path to survival. By Tuesday morning, media outlets reported that the company had agreed to quarterly training, anonymous reporting apps, diversity benchmarks tied to bonuses, and a $20 million scholarship fund, and public opinion began to shift, grudging respect growing for a corporation forced into humility, while admiration swelled for Malcolm Carter, who had chosen not to destroy them outright but to demand transformation. Sofia Ramirez, whose live stream had made the world a witness, sat for interviews on national morning shows, her voice calm as she described the night. And when asked why she kept filming, she replied simply, "Because I knew the world needed to see the truth." And her follower count soared past 1 million, a career transformed by one act of courage. As for Malcolm, he issued only a single public statement in those 72 hours, a brief message recorded in his office, his voice steady, his gaze direct. This was never about one person. This was about dignity, about accountability, about change. And my hope is that no man or woman, no matter their appearance, is ever again treated the way I was treated. Not in this industry, not in any industry. And the video was replayed across every network, his quiet words resonating louder than anger. And by Wednesday morning, 72 hours after Heather Collins first shouted for security, the world understood that a new standard had been set, that a man humiliated had chosen not revenge, but reform. And that choice had shaken an empire, broken a culture of silence, and begun a transformation whose echoes would be felt far beyond the decks of one yacht in Miami. 6 months after the night that shook the luxury hospitality world, the Liberty Star once again sailed into the waters of Miami, her decks gleaming beneath strings of golden lights. Yet the atmosphere this time was transformed, more diverse, more inclusive, and more hopeful than any gala the city had ever seen. And at the center of it all stood Malcolm Carter, dressed in the same understated navy blazer he had worn on that humiliating evening. A quiet reminder that dignity does not need costume to command respect. And as he looked out across the crowd of 300 guests, he saw faces that represented not only wealth, but also change. Black entrepreneurs shaking hands with white bankers, Latina business leaders in conversation with Asian tech executives, young scholarship recipients in modest suits, mingling with the very CEOs whose companies now funded their futures. And the air carried not the sharp edge of arrogance, but the hum of possibility. Charles Whitman approached with a new steadiness in his step, his hair thinner, his eyes older, the strain of the past months etched into his face. But beside him walked 2 new vice presidents, one a black woman promoted from regional operations, the other a young Latino man recruited through the new diversity initiative, and Charles introduced them with genuine pride, acknowledging that Malcolm's conditions had not only saved the company from collapse, but had given it new life. And as he shook Malcolm's hand, he said quietly, "We thought you came to destroy us, but you came to save us, though it cost us everything we thought we knew." Malcolm nodded, his expression calm, knowing that true transformation always demanded sacrifice. And then his gaze shifted across the deck to a woman standing at the edge of the crowd, dressed in a simple black dress, her hair pulled back, her eyes lowered but steady, and the guests murmured as they recognized Heather Collins, no longer the arrogant hostess who had sneered and shouted, but a woman visibly humbled, her career in ruins, her name infamous, yet here by Malcolm's invitation, for he had insisted that her story become part of the training modules rolled out across the industry. Her humiliation turned into education, and tonight she was not there to serve, not there to host, but to speak. When the time came, she stepped onto the small stage, her voice trembling as she addressed the crowd. 6 months ago, I made choices that revealed the ugliest parts of me, choices that humiliated a man of integrity, choices that nearly destroyed my company, choices that cost me the respect of my colleagues and the trust of the world. And tonight I stand here not to ask forgiveness, but to confess, to acknowledge, and to remind you that arrogance and prejudice can live in any heart if left unchecked. And her words carried no performance, no polish, but the raw edge of regret. And some in the crowd wiped tears as they heard the pain in her tone. For humility is sometimes the only redemption left to those who have fallen so far. The scholarship recipients applauded her bravery, seeing in her story a lesson that power without empathy collapses, while executives shifted in discomfort, realizing how easily they too could have been her. Malcolm then stepped forward, his voice steady as he addressed the gathering. 6 months ago, I chose not to destroy but to demand change, and tonight we see the fruit of that decision. A company transformed, an industry shifting, young leaders rising who will carry this torch further than I ever could. And behind him, screens lit up with numbers that spoke louder than words. Discrimination complaints across Oceanic Prestige down by 70%. Diverse hires in management up by 35%. Scholarship funds already placing 100 students into programs they never could have afforded. And other yacht service companies voluntarily adopting the same standards out of fear of being left behind. Proof that the storm of one night had become the tide of an entire industry. Sofia Ramirez, her phone once again live, whispered to her millions of followers that they were watching history repeat, but in reverse. Not the humiliation of a man, but the redemption of a system. And her viewers responded with praise, with hope, with stories of their own battles against bias. For the story had given them language, had given them courage. Heather stepped off the stage into quiet applause, some guests hesitant, others genuine. And though she would never reclaim the career she once chased, she had found a different path. Now working as a diversity trainer, her story requested at conferences, her testimony used in classrooms, her shame turned into service, and though she still carried scars, they had become part of something larger than herself. Charles Whitman, too, had changed. No longer the nervous manager terrified of contracts slipping away, but a leader humbled into empathy, meeting monthly with scholarship students, attending bias training alongside his staff, proving that accountability can reform not only companies but hearts. And in private moments, he admitted that losing sleep over the scandal had given him back his conscience, a trade he considered worth the cost. As the evening wore on, Malcolm raised his glass to the crowd, his voice lifting above the music and conversation. To those who came tonight, remember this: prejudice costs more than money. It costs dignity. It costs futures. It costs generations. but when we confront it, when we demand better, we not only protect ourselves, we build a system that protects those who come after us. And the guests raised their glasses in solemn agreement, the clinking sound echoing like a covenant. In that moment, the story reached its final act, not with vengeance, not with collapse, but with transformation. The humiliation of one man turned into the redemption of many. And as Malcolm Carter stood beneath the stars, his daughter at his side, his company stronger than ever, his industry changed by his hand, the truth became undeniable, that sometimes the greatest revolutions begin not with battles or speeches, but with a single refusal to bow, a single choice to turn pain into progress, a single demand that dignity must never again be negotiable. Thank you so much for watching and supporting these powerful stories. If this one moved you, don't forget to hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel. Your voice helps keep these stories alive.